some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that her
What about the Chautauqua incident?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
We
more of a community.
before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
What can you learn from garbage? According to activist Annie Leonard, quite a bit. Leonard has visited dumps and factories in 40 countries to find out where stuff comes from and where it ends up. From her research came The Story of Stuff, a popular web video that addresses the environmental, economic, and social impacts of consumerism. In a special conversation from Juniata College in Huntington, Pennsylvania, we talk with activist Annie Leonard. But first, here's a short clip from The Story of Stuff.
Do you have one of these? I got a little obsessed with mine. In fact, I got a little obsessed with all my stuff. Have you ever wondered where all the stuff we buy comes from and where it goes when we throw it out? I couldn't stop wondering about that, so I looked it up. And what the textbook said is that stuff moves through a system from extraction to production to distribution to consumption to disposal. All together, it's called the materials economy. Well, I looked into it a little bit more. In fact, I spent 10 years traveling the world, tracking where our stuff comes from and where it goes. And you know what I found out? That is not the whole story. There is a lot missing from this explanation. For one thing, this system looks like it's fine. No problem. But the truth is, it's a system in crisis. And the reason it's a system in crisis is it's a linear system and we live on a finite planet. And you cannot run a linear system on a finite planet indefinitely. Every step along the way, this system is interacting with the real world. In real life, it's not happening on a blank white page. It's interacting with societies, cultures, economies, the environment. And all along the way, it's bumping up against limits. Limits we don't see here because the diagram is incomplete. So let's go back through. Let's fill in some of the blanks and see what's missing. Well, one of the most important things that's missing is people. Yes, people. People live and work all along this system. And some people in this system matter a little more than others. Some have a little more say. Who are they?
Annie Leonard, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Your 20-minute video, The Story of Stuff, has become an online phenomenon. It's spreading like a virus on the internet. Give us a synopsis of the film and what led you to produce it in the first place.
Well, it's been a fascinating experience, I must say. I was not expecting this kind of response at all to the film. The film is basically a fast-paced, fact-filled, often funny, 20-minute look at our materials economy, which basically means how we make, use, and throw away stuff. I was very lucky in the fact that I was able to spend about 20 years traveling around the world looking at literally hundreds of the factories where our stuff is made and the dumps where our stuff is dumped. You know, from Haiti to South Africa to India. It was amazing. And what I saw in all my travels was that all of this stuff in our life, our electronics, our clothing, our shoes, our appliances, our furniture, our cars, everything has enormous hidden environmental and social and health impacts before it gets to us and after it leaves us, as well as while we do have it. And most of those impacts are hidden from view. And so I wanted to make those visible. I wanted to sort of shine the light on the life of all of our stuff before we get it and afterwards, to just get people to think a little more critically about where's all this stuff coming from and where is it going. You teamed up with Free Range Studios, and some people may be familiar with this outfit if they saw the short animated film Matrix about factory farming. The film, when it came out in December of 2007, as I said, it spread like a virus through the internet. Last I read, 7.3 million people worldwide had viewed it. Schools throughout the country and perhaps the world have looked at it. What were you hoping for when you did the film? I mean, did you have any inkling that it would take off like it has? I had no inkling, and in fact, in our proposals when we were planning for the film, we thought that success would be if 50,000 people see this film, and we got that in about 4 hours. I mean, I was floored. It's now been viewed over 10 million times by people, according to Google Analytics, in over 220 countries and territories. It's been translated into dozens of languages. It's been on national television in a handful of countries all over the world. It's just amazed me, and sort of ironically, my goal was partly to turn the volume up on the discourse about the way that we make and use and throw away stuff, but partly it was to free me up from having to keep talking about this because the film was actually based on a live presentation that I do. The live presentation is 45 minutes long, so it's everything in the Story of Stuff plus more, and I just got asked to give it constantly. And I have a daughter, I want to hang out at home. I just could not constantly be on the road giving this talk, so I thought, let's make a film, and then people will stop asking me to give this talk, and that definitely backfired.
Now, you grew up in Seattle, Washington. You went to Barnard College, which is part of Columbia. You went to graduate school at Cornell. I'm wondering where along this route, this path, did you become so interested in stuff, in garbage, and what happens to it?
I can tell you exactly, I can pinpoint it even, I know exactly what happened.
An epiphany moment.
Yeah, so what led up to it, the background was I grew up in Seattle in a very environmentally aware family. We used to spend a lot of summers camping in the North Cascades, which is a beautiful mountainous area. And as a kid, when we would be driving to go camping, since it was before the days of DVD players and cars, we used to actually look out the window and talk to each other. And my siblings and I would notice that the forests were further and further away each summer when we would go camping. The mini malls stretched a little further. We'd pass more clear cuts. As our little car was driving up the mountain roads, we'd pass these logging trucks with huge logs on them. And as a kid, I remember looking at that stuff, and it was before I knew about carbon sequestration and hydrologic cycles and all the very vital services that forests provide. I just remember thinking, what's going on? Who's taking those trees? Why would someone cut them down? So I decided I wanted to study environmental issues, and I went to college in New York City. And my dorm was on 110th Street, and my campus was on 116th Street. And every morning I would walk those 6 blocks, and literally there were shoulder-high piles of garbage the whole way. And I'm from Seattle. We don't have shoulder-high piles of garbage all over. I was just so curious about what is in that stuff. So that's where I picked up my funny, somewhat embarrassing habit of digging through garbage. Whenever I go to a new place, I love to dig through the garbage because you can really find out what's going on in that community. So I opened the bags, and to my shock, they were almost all paper. And I said, this is what those forests are being cut down for, is like pizza boxes and office paper. So I said, but every day when I come home from class, they'd be gone. So I said, well, where is the stuff going afterwards? So I took a trip to the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island, where New York City's garbage went.
The landfill in the country, the biggest one in the country.
Biggest landfill. Many say, along with the Great Wall of China, it's one of 2 man-made structures you can see from space. I mean, this thing is huge. And this is where I found my life's calling. I stood at the edge of this landfill, and I looked out in all directions. As far as I could see was waste. Appliances, food, books, shoes. It was just a horrible tragedy, a horrible waste. And I had been grown up to think, you don't waste. Like, one doesn't waste. That's dumb to waste stuff. And I just kept thinking, this is really wrong. And how can we run an economy based on that level and speed of trashing materials? And I also wondered, why is no one talking about this? Like, it really stunned me. I encourage everyone to go to their landfill. I think it should be required before you get a driver's license in this country. So that's where it started. I said, I want to figure out, how was this system created? Why are we tolerating it? And what can we do to change it? Because it was just clearly wrong.
Now, you talked about turning up the volume, and your 20-minute video, and there's not just one now, there's really a series. There's the Story of Stuff project, which has a number of offshoots, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But this really has turned up the volume. People who've come on board, as well as critics who say, wait a minute, you're trying to change the way this country operates. You're anti-capitalist. You're Marx with a ponytail. There are lots of people who are also angry with you. How do you respond to that? And who mostly would you say are your critics?
Well, one thing that's very nice is that we got almost no negative feedback for the first 20 months. I'm flooded with literally tens of thousands of emails from people who say, say it like it is. Finally, someone said the truth. People are so happy. I feel like one of the reasons the film was so successful is it tapped into a growing sense of dis-ease that people in this country have, that people know that economically, environmentally, socially, in terms of public health, our country is moving in the wrong direction, and we could do better. And so I felt very buoyed and supported by the literally millions of people who loved the film. It was out for almost 2 years before the critics even found out about it. Those trend spotters on Fox News found out about it and made a big fuss.
Glenn Beck made a big fuss.
Yes, made a big fuss. I find their critiques very interesting. the number one critique they have is they say that I'm anti-capitalist. And so that really got me thinking, because when I set out to make this film, critiquing capitalism was nowhere on my radar screen. My goal was to show and explain to people what I had seen in 20 years of looking at the factories where our stuff is made and the dumps where our stuff is dumped. It was as simple as that. I was not aiming to critique capitalism. I did critique a system that allows us to use reproductive toxins and neurotoxins in our children's toys, in our clothing, in our cosmetics. I did critique a system that values wealthy people more and gives greater protection to wealthy people than poor people. I did critique a system that treats workers and communities as expendable and poisons them. So when people came to me and said, you're critiquing capitalism, I say, well, wait a minute, so are you saying capitalism condones the use of toxic chemicals? Are you saying capitalism values rich people more than poor? Are you saying capitalism treats communities and workers as expendable? If so, then there's some real problems with capitalism. Let's put it on the table and talk about it. So I want to thank Glenn Beck and others for pointing out that that's really what we were talking about here.
Some also say what you're doing is indoctrination, and mostly you hear that argument around the fact that this video has really caught fire in schools around the country.
Around the world,
Around
actually.
the world.
It's amazing. That was another big surprise. At one point in the film, I have the words, "you suck," and somebody at Free Range Studios said, you should take that out because they won't show it in schools. And I laughed. I said, they're not going to show this film in schools. Oh. It just totally surprised me. Literally thousands and thousands of schools in the US and internationally are showing it. Everything from 4th grade to Oxford postgraduate economics classes. It's just amazing. Economics professors love it. They say it summarizes the whole semester. Actually, I was just at a college yesterday and the environmental economics professor raised his hand and he said, if you keep making films, I'm not going to be able to have a job. So it's been tremendous support from teachers. A lot of teachers have written in and asked for additional information. And so one of the things I'm thrilled about is that we're partnering with a group in Seattle called Facing the Future, and we're making a curriculum for teachers who want to use this film as a conversation starter. It's not meant to be indoctrination, it's meant to start a conversation, and it certainly has done that. So for teachers who are using it, they can show the film, and then we're providing a whole bunch of curriculum, hands out, exercise, all kinds of things for other teachers who want to use it.
When you made the film, did you have the idea that this was for an American audience or that this was for an international audience?
That's a great question. I said in the that it was based on a 45-minute live talk. The 45-minute talk is much more international. And we tried, even talking as fast as I do, we could not fit the whole thing into 20 minutes. And we thought that 20 minutes was really was the maximum attention span we could get for someone to sit on TV and watch a show about the materials economy. So we just had to cut something out, and it was so painful. We cut out the bulk of the international stuff. We couldn't find any other chunk that fit out so well. And I thought, you know, it's primarily in the United States that we have this consumption mania. The United States has 5% of the world's population and uses over 30% of the world's resources. So we are the audience that most needs to hear this message and think more critically about the way we use stuff. So we figured it's for the US and we'll make international ones later. But to our shock, it's all over. It's been translated into Russian, Chinese, Arabic. It's all over the world. It's been a huge success.
The statistic you just used just a moment ago, the United States makes up 5% of the world's population and produces, uses 30% of the resources and uses or creates 30% of the waste. One critic said, yes, but we produce 27% of the world's GDP. Well, one of the things I explore more deeply in the book is the problem with GDP as a metric of success. The primary way that we measure our success and progress in this country is GDP. And one of my friends who's an ecological economist, Dave Batker, I interviewed him recently. I said, what do you think about the GDP? And he said, that is a big, dumb number. The GDP is basically, it's a measure of how much money changes hands, or how much materials changes hands. It's not a measure of, are we getting happier? Are we getting healthier? Is our air getting cleaner? Are our schools getting better? It's sort of like if a business listed all the money they spent and all the money they took in and added it together into one big number. It gives you no sense of how that business is doing. And so if you think about it, the GDP, what contributes to GDP? If you get diagnosed with cancer, GDP goes up. If you get in a car crash, GDP goes up. If you spill a bunch of hazardous waste and it has to be cleaned up, GDP goes up. If you build because it's putting people to work.
Right. Well, yeah, it is putting people to work. It's just making money change hands. You know, sometimes that's people to work, sometimes it's just money changing hands. But those things are not always good. So one of the things I argue for instead is a different metric. You know, we pay attention to what we measure. Let's measure human happiness and well-being. Let's measure health. Things like the genuine progress indicator. There's lots of other statistics that we could be using, or metrics we could be using to track our progress.
In fact, you say we should be measuring the ecology, not measuring the economy. And I'm wondering, Does anyone do that, and how do you do it?
Yeah, there's some wonderful metrics of this. My favorite one is called the Happy Planet Index, which is produced by the New Economics Foundation in London. And they take two different metrics. One is how happy a country is, which is calculated by their life expectancy times their life satisfaction, over how many resources they use, or their national footprint. So it's basically a metric of how effective or how efficient a country is at converting natural resources into human well-being. So it turns out we are not very good at that. In the 2009, the most recent Happy Planet Index, out of 140 countries, we're 114th.
And Costa Rica was number one. I think a lot of people are shaking their heads saying, Costa Rica? Why? How?
Yeah. Well, Costa Rica has a higher life expectancy, a higher level of life satisfaction than we do in the United States, and they're using a quarter of the resources. To me, that's very inspiring because it makes me realize we could be so much more efficient. We could waste so much less and make such a better society. One of the things Costa Rica did, I'd like to point out, is they decided to abolish their military and redivert all of those funds into social well-being. So they have great schools, great healthcare, great infrastructure, all kinds of social investments rather than military investments.
You said that surveys show that Americans were at their happiest in the 50s when we certainly had far less stuff.
Right. I think that's another very interesting and very hopeful bit of data. If you look at the United States and Europe, we have both taken very different paths on this. The United States traded the gains in productivity that we got from the Industrial Revolution and technological advances. We traded those gains in productivity for more stuff. So we continue to work harder than people in any other industrialized country except maybe South Korea. We work very long hours. We're increasingly socially isolated. 40% of Americans don't know their next door neighbor's names. A quarter of Americans don't have one friend to talk to. So we're increasingly socially isolated. We're working like crazy. We're spending more time watching TV and shopping, less time engaged in community activities, less time on vacation. We're one of the only industrialized countries without a mandatory vacation law. Europe took a very different path where they traded those gains in productivity for greater leisure rather than for more stuff. So they have smaller houses, smaller cars, smaller and fewer TVs, and they have those cute little refrigerators that they all have in Europe. They have less stuff, but more leisure and stronger communities. And I would like to propose that if you're choosing between stuff and leisure time, quality time, relaxing time with friends and family, it's actually the leisure time and the time with friends and family and living in a less stressed way that makes people happier.
I'm thinking of the bumper sticker that I'm thinking most people have seen. He who dies with the most toys wins.
Right.
If all of this stuff isn't really making us happier, why do we buy into it?
That's a very good question. I think there's a couple reasons. One is I think a lot of people are just realizing it now. You know, we've been bombarded with advertisements and messages to buy, and you know, we're targeted with 3,000 messages a day that say you will be happier, you will be more loved, you will be more successful if you buy this latest thing. And I think people bought into that for a long time and are beginning to sense that it's not working, and they're tired and people are stressed. And that's what I talk about, the sort of growing sense of dis-ease that I feel like the film tapped into. But it takes a while of trying that before you realize this is not actually working. There's some very interesting data about what really does make people happy. And it turns out that across socioeconomic sectors, across classes, across races, across ages, even across nationalities, after a point, you know, once your basic needs are met, more stuff does not make you happy. The things that make you happy are the quality of your social relations, a sense of meaning beyond yourself, and coming together with others towards a shared goal. Yet we're sacrificing all of those things in order to have ever more stuff, and it's just not working. But even once you've made this realization, even if you want to work less and spend more time with your kids and your family and your friends and communities, it's hard to because the way that our economy is structured. For example, if you don't work full time, you might not get health insurance. So a lot of people are stuck in full-time jobs even though they'd be happy to work 3/4 time and scale down their consumption, but they can't because of the health insurance. There's a lot of structural things that we would need to do to facilitate people working less and spending more time with their families.
You talked about this habit of yours of going from city to city and looking through dumpsters and trash bags, and you talked about it as this neuroses almost, and that at times it's been lonely. My guess is since this film has taken off as it has, you're a lot less lonely, that there are more people on board who are saying, how can I help, what can I do? Has it changed? Has the environment that you're pitching this message to, has it changed much?
You know, I think that the environment hasn't changed as much as my ability to communicate what it is that I care about. I am fascinated by garbage, and I love to look in garbage cans and dumps when I go to a new city, because it's like looking at a city's secret journal. It's like looking behind stage and seeing
And
what's
they're really that
happening.
different from place to place.
Oh, very different. Yeah, they're very different. You can find out about what kind of trade they have, import export. You can figure out how busy they are, if they're having more prepared food packaging versus fresh food packaging. You can find out about you can find out about how they treat the poorest people in society, because there's often the poorest people in society are pulling out the most valuable resources from garbage. So you can figure out some about social relations. You can find out so much from looking at a city's garbage. It's absolutely fascinating. But for me, when I look at a pile of garbage, I see things about how that society views each other and the planet. I see things about the kinds of chemicals and regulations that they have. I can see all these different things. And I realized I wasn't explaining that well enough. I was just talking about garbage. So people who are working on issues of social justice or childhood health might look at me and say, well, she works on garbage. I work on childhood health. I was realizing that I was contributing to sort of fractioning of the environmental and public health movement. And by myself learning how to talk about garbage in a way that exposes all those connections, all these people who used to think that we all worked on something different are saying, oh, we work on that too. So it was really me that changed more than the landscape.
Based on your investigations of garbage, is there a best place to live? I mean, could you pinpoint a place that they live right in this town or this city?
People ask me that all the time, and there's no perfect place. In terms of garbage, the real goal is zero waste. And while there's no perfect places, there are pieces of zero all over. San Francisco is phenomenal. What they have done, they have reached over 72% diversion rate, which means 72% of the garbage that was going to be disposed is now being recycled or composted or prevented. So in terms of big urban cities, San Francisco is a model from which many cities could learn. Europe, though, has taken it much further. They've gone upstream, and they're saying design the waste out of the system, design the toxics out of the system. Garbage is a problem both in terms of volume, the quantity, but also in terms of the quality, the toxicity. If it wasn't so loaded full of toxic chemicals, it wouldn't be so problematic. So Europe has said, instead of trying to figure out what to do with it at the end, get the toxics out of production. You know, for example, electronic waste is an enormously toxic component of our waste stream. And in Europe, the European Union has just said, get the toxics out of electronics. Or cosmetics. You know, we're putting all these cosmetics and personal care products on our body, sunscreen, lipsticks that have carcinogens and neurotoxins. Europe has said, just get those out of the products. So Europe has done some really great things on cleaning up their production processes.
Well, the interesting thing about what you're saying is in the 28 countries of the European Union, where they say take these out, they revolve around the precautionary principle.
Right.
If there is a belief, not proof, that this can cause harm, then it's eliminated. And so what's happening is that manufacturers are making one product for Europe for sale, distribution in Europe, and another for sale in the United States. What do you make of that, and what role, in your opinion, does the government need to play in all of this?
Oh, gosh, there's so many important things to say about that. It's absolutely true about the dual lines. And in some cases, we're actually getting the cleaner stuff too, because the factories are making the cleaner stuff for Europe. But even then, where we do get the cleaner ones, it's as a result of European democracy, not even our own democracy. And it's a great example to look at Europe and see how they were able to get so many companies to use less toxics, because those same companies here say, oh, it's not possible, our business will collapse. And I feel like, do they think we don't have the internet and friends in France? Like, we're going to find out what they're doing over there. It's crazy that they think they can keep getting away with this. So one of the things I would ask your viewers is to say, why not here? If you can have cosmetics and electronics without toxic chemicals in Europe, why not here? You know, we should demand the same. But the question about the role of the government is a really important one. One of the facts in one of the lines in the film that I've said that some of the critics have latched onto is when I say it's the government's job to watch out for us, to take care of us. And I have to keep telling people, I don't mean to help you floss your teeth and tuck you into bed at night. I mean to help ensure the general welfare of the people and public health, environmental stability, these sorts of things. Some people have written in and said it's the government's job to get out of our way, and this country was built on individual success. There are lots of things we can determine success for at the individual level, but there are some things that we need a collective response to. So for example, the toxic chemicals. I eat organic food. I don't use Teflon pans. I don't have PVC in my house. I don't use Scotchgard. Like I'm so vigilant, it's the point of neurotic. I would not wish my level of vigilance on anyone. It's, it's not always fun. But I just had my own body burden testing, and my body is loaded with toxic chemicals. And it
Despite all those efforts.
Despite all those efforts.
Which has lots of people thinking, well, this is a losing battle.
No, it's a losing battle to try to protect yourself at the individual level. It's a losing battle to try to protect yourself at the grocery store, choosing between this or this. What we've got to do is get these toxics out of productions. And there are times throughout our history, if you look at, for example, ending slaves, did we go to each slaveholder and explain, oh, let me explain to you why you should get rid of slaves? That would have taken forever. We cannot go to every single person and teach them how to use Good Guide and Skin Deep and how to always make the environmentally preferable option. We've got to just get those toxic products off the shelf.
Now, you said that quickly, and I want to give it a little more emphasis. You said we should go to Good Guide and Skin Deep. You're referencing two online sites, goodguide.com and skindeep.com, that tell consumers where they can find products that don't have toxins in them and that are safer to use.
Absolutely. I love both Good Guide and Skin Deep. I think they're phenomenal transitional tools. What they do is you can look up tens of thousands of personal care products and other products. Now, Good Guide has expanded to electronics and lots of different things. And you can look at what toxic chemicals these products contain, what the health impacts are, and then if you choose not to have those, which I think most people choose, it has less toxic alternatives. That's great, but it's not enough to really bring about the change we need. We cannot expect every single person on the planet to study this stuff and then go into the grocery store. And why should the onus be on us? I mean, if these producers are choosing, if these companies are choosing to get into the business of personal care products, the onus should be on them to make them in a safe way. So great, use Skin Deep now, and use Good Guide now, but probably the most important button on Good Guide is the send a message to the manufacturer right now button, and click on that and say, get the toxics out of production.
I want to backtrack in your life for a moment, because back in the late 1980s, I think around 1988, you worked for 10 years as an activist with Greenpeace, and what drew you to Greenpeace was the international trafficking of waste going from richer nations to poorer nations. Tell us a little bit about the situation. Where is it going, and how has that changed over the last couple of decades?
And that was a fascinating decade, and I feel like it was a real blossoming of my sort of political consciousness of understanding how the world worked. So in the late 1980s, there was a big panic about garbage in this country, and there were a number, 400 as a matter of fact, 400 proposals to build incinerators, big machines that burn garbage in this country, because garbage was washing up on the beach in New York. People were worried landfills were getting filled up, and communities really rallied and said, we don't want these things in our communities. They create enormous toxic pollution, they create enormous ash, we don't want them. So what we were hoping was that by putting the pressure on options for getting rid of garbage cheap and easily, that we would create pressure upstream for municipalities and institutions to reduce their waste at source, to implement clean production, zero waste, those kinds of things. And some did. That's when curbside recycling programs happened. A lot of progress happened. But some companies and cities that were really set on continuing to make waste instead literally started loading it up on ships and taking it to third world countries.
Reduce, reuse, recycle. You say there's a good reason why recycle is
That's
number
right.
3 and not number 1.
Absolutely. Recycling is the last thing you should do with your waste. Recycling is what you do when your back is against the wall and you have no other options. Recycling is in many ways an admission of defeat. It's like we could not think of any way to design this waste out of use. The problem comes when people look at increasing recycling as the goal rather than decreasing waste. For example, there's a college campus recycling contest that happens around the country every year. And one year, the college that won was found that they went to Costco and bought pallets and pallets of single-use disposable water bottles so that they had more to recycle, which is crazy. The goal is not to recycle more, the goal is to waste less. But when we focus on recycling, we can inadvertently encourage single-use throwaway products because you're recycling them. So then you get all this feel-good energy around recycling when it's actually still using resources and creating pollution. We need to reduce how much waste we use, and we need to reduce the toxicity of the things that we're using. We need to recycle and reuse and compost, and after we have reduced as much as we can.
You mentioned that you've had your body burden measured, the level of toxicity in your own system. I imagine you've also measured your own carbon footprint. And you walk the talk. Give us an idea of your consumption life. What's a week look like?
Well, one of the things that I do that reduces my consumption and increases my personal happiness and joy, which I really recommend, is I live in community. I know my neighbors and we're friends and we share things. I live in a community in the Bay Area in California where most of the block are my very good friends. And so we have one pickup truck for 12 families. We have one barbecue that we share. We have one hot tub. We have one swing set. We have one ladder. We have one pair of garden pruners, and we share all of these things. And so by living in community and helping each other out, we watch each other's kids, we cook dinner for each other. By living like this, I mean, it's not a commune, we all have our own individual houses, and I tell people all the kids know who their parents are. It's, it's conventional families, but just by sharing more, when we need something, we're able to turn to our community first rather than the market. So it allows us to extract ourselves from this just constant consumption mania, because we don't all need to own a bundt pan. We don't all need to own a wheelbarrow. One person has a big TV, and when people want to watch TV, they go to that house and watch it. We have more fun and we have less stuff. That means we spend less money, we have to work less to pay for all this stuff, and we just have much more fun.
That would require a sea change in so many, and I use the word communities loosely, to create the kind of community you've created where you live.
It baffles me that it's so different. I recently visited my sister who lives in one of these big McMansions in New Jersey, and I had my child with me, and her neighbor had a climbing structure. And I said, I want to take my kid over there and use the climbing structure. I said, can I call your neighbors and see if it's okay? And she said, I don't know them. I said, you have 2 kids and your neighbors have a climbing structure and you don't know them? Like, how is that possibly serving anyone to not know each other? So what I recommend is people start inviting their neighbors over for dinner. Just start building up that conversation. The more
breaking bread is a good way to get this started.
Absolutely. Bake cookies for each other, make muffins, have a potluck dinner. There's a great new book I just love that's called The Sharing Solution. And they're saying that in terms of the economic crisis that we're having, where we have to use our dollars more wisely, in terms of the ecological crisis we're having, where we need to use our resources more wisely, and in terms of the social crisis we're having, where people are increasingly isolated, a big solution is just to share. And so this new book called The Sharing Solution by Nolo Press has really practical tips. Do you want to share a car with a neighbor? Do you want to share supplies and tools? I mean, there's so many things you can share that allow you to save money, allow you to conserve resources, and you begin to rebuild that social fabric that's the true source of happiness rather than all this stuff that we keep buying.
Now, nothing increases our carbon footprint quicker than traveling by air. And of course, getting your message out involves this dilemma, I would guess, for you, that you're traveling not just throughout the United States, but internationally. How do you compensate for that?
Traveling by air is so carbon intensive, there is no way to compensate for that. I live in community, so we use less stuff. Buying less stuff helps. My house is fueled by solar power, so that helps. My own personal car in the Bay Area is a solar-powered car powered by my solar system, so I don't have to go to gas stations. That all helps. I take public transit as much as possible. That all helps. But I think even all that together would knock off a couple of flights a year. Flying is really carbon intensive. So unfortunately, I can't compensate for it. And it's something I weigh carefully, and I'm not convinced it's worth the flights. And so we're looking into things like Skype casting and webcasting and other ways to communicate that don't involve so many flights, because they really are very environmentally destructive, and I'm sure we're not going to be able to fly around the way that we do now, in another decade.
I want to go back for a moment to Daniel Goleman and his book, Ecological Intelligence. The subtitle of that book is How Knowing the Hidden Impacts of What We Buy Can Change Everything. And in fact, Time magazine said that particular notion was one of the 10 ideas changing the world right now. The reason I bring that up is you've talked a lot about coltan in e-products and electronics. Coltan is that metal that's mined in the Congo, and it's what keeps our iPods and all of our other electronics from overheating. If we knew the problems that resulted in the Congo over that metal, do you think people would change their behaviors?
I think it's a very important first step. It's sufficient. What is it? Necessary but not sufficient. It's very important for us to know. I think that people in the United States are good, compassionate, decent people, and if we really knew the social and health and violence and other kinds of problems that our consumption is adding to, I think that people wouldn't want that. But knowledge alone is not enough. I'm not a subscriber to the theory that the truth will set us free, because if it would, we would be free, because we actually know the truth. but it's really organizing an action and getting involved in a civil society and an engaged democracy. Knowledge with action is what is going to turn things around. Knowledge by itself can actually be disempowering and depressing, because it's a bummer to find out that your shampoo contains neurotoxins or your iPod fueled violent revolutions in Congo. That's not an empowering thing unless it's combined with actions to change the situation.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I said thousands of schools throughout this country and internationally have been using the story of stuff as part of their curricula. A family, some parents in Missoula, Montana, went to their school board when their son came home, worried, I think, about whether he should buy Legos. He was so worked up over this video. The father said this is anti-capitalist, and the school board pulled the video. So I guess I'm wondering about that balance. When kids see it, they do internalize it and they say, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, but that's...
Well, it turns out the situation in Missoula wasn't as clear as that. It wasn't that they banned the video. It was what they said is that you have to have an open, unbiased discussion afterwards, and that you have to show different viewpoints. The teacher did push back a little and say, you know, what am I supposed to show for an alternative viewpoint? SUV ads? But in any case, I think that's fair enough. We should show different viewpoints. So the Missoula School Board, we talked with them on the phone at length, and they said they're very happy to have people show the video as long as they're showing different viewpoints and encouraging an open discussion. So I feel like some of that story was a little bit misunderstood. And so I was very glad to hear that the Missoula School Board had not actually banned it. It's true that the film can be unsettling and scary, but the truth is that the environmental situation is scary, and we should be unsettled, and we need to be unsettled. If we continue on this current path of just plundering the planet, that's even more scary. We're right now using globally 1.5 planets worth of resources each year. We only have one planet. You cannot use 1.5 planets worth of resources indefinitely. So some people say, oh, it's depressing, it's hard. It's going to be a lot more depressing and a lot harder if we don't do anything about it. A lot of people ask me, do I think we're going to change? Do I think we can change things? I am absolutely positive that we are going to change. You can't use 1.5 planets worth of resources indefinitely, so we're definitely going to change. The question is, are we going to change by design or by default? And if we change by design, it means we come together, we admit we have to make some changes, we have to live differently in some ways, and together we figure out how to do that compassionately and intelligently. And there's so many exciting innovations in the fields of green chemistry and biomimicry and green energy. I mean, there's so much potential for us to live better. So if we change by design, it's going to be hard, but at least we're moving in the right direction. If we dig our heels in, refuse to have this discussion, shield our children from it, shield our politicians from it, we're still going to change, but by default, it's going to be a lot uglier, a lot more violent, and a lot less fair. So I'm for having the conversation now, even if it's hard, and moving us in the right direction.
Some people think this is like trying to turn around the Titanic, and I'm going to have you talk about that in a moment, but I'm wondering what you see in all of this as the most pressing environmental and social justice issues today.
What I see as the most pressing issue is our disengagement from civil society in this country. I go around the country and I show the Story of Stuff film, and almost always someone raises their hand and says, what can I buy differently to solve this problem? And the film lays out a pretty broad set of pretty serious issues. Or sometimes someone will say, what can we do to change this? What can we do to get involved? And so I like to sort of take the temperature of where people are. And so in audiences all across the country, I say, well, what can you think of to do? And it's almost always shopping, and it's almost always individual actions. I could ride a bike, I could carry a cloth bag, I could buy PVC free, or I could buy organic. We're really stuck in this consumer individual part of ourselves. And I've come to see all of us have two different parts of ourselves. We have a consumer part of ourselves, an individual part of ourselves, and we have a community and civil citizen part of ourselves. And the individual consumer part of ourselves is spoken to and nurtured and stroked and validated from day one. And anyone with a child
Literally
knows it's from day one. And so we're very comfortable being consumers, and we end up sort of overdeveloping our sense of being a consumer, whereas the citizen part of us has atrophied. And so we're losing that muscle. And so even faced with something as severe as planetary climatic change, as severe as running out of fish in the world's oceans, as severe as running out of water in many places, as severe as toxic chemical chemicals even being found in brand newborn babies' umbilical cords. I mean, the crises are really serious, and the most that we can think of to do is shop differently. So to me, the thing that most scares me is the loss of that citizen muscle. And that's why when people say, what can I do? I don't even care what you do, just start doing something. You know, find something that excites you and turns you on. If you're interested in food, work for a CSA or organic food in your public schools. If you're interested in transportation, work for bike lanes or mass transit. If you're tired of working like a dog and you're envious of your friends in Europe who have these month-long vacations, work for a mandatory national vacation law. You know, there's so many things that we can do. I like to tell people there's so many things to do. You don't even have to do something boring. Like, just start doing something to reinvigorate that citizen muscle, because we are not going to get the level of citizen engagement and the level of power to really make a difference until people start re-engaging with each other as citizens, not just as consumers.
So clearly we're not going to buy our way out of this, but I think there's still people who are saying, is fair trade important? Should I buy fair trade products? Should I buy organics? And I think the answer is yes.
Absolutely. You know, when we do shop, of course we should buy the least toxic, least exploitative product available. Absolutely. Local products are great. Keep the money in the local community. You reduce the carbon footprint of things that are have traveled. Used products are even better, because then you're not adding to the upstream waste production because it's already been produced. Sharing and not buying stuff is even better than that. Of course we should be conscious consumers. But the problem is that the real solutions that we need are not for sale in the store. They are limited and predetermined. I mean, the choices available to us at the store are limited and predetermined by forces outside of the store. And that's where we need to be looking. So rather than becoming an expert at looking at all the different sunscreens and finding out which ones have neurotoxins and which ones have endocrine disruptors, let's instead look at the government and say, get those health-impairing toxic chemicals out of my sunscreen.
You've mentioned sunscreen twice, and I just learned and was shocked that sunscreen is ending up by the tons in our oceans and killing coral reef.
Yeah. We got to clean that stuff up. You know, it's like we have one planet, it's beautiful, it's not strong enough to continue to thrive the way that we're treating it. We've just got to do better.
Now, in 1992, you actually testified before Congress about trafficking of waste to other countries. That was 18 years ago. Why do these other countries take the waste? And then I want to talk a little bit about where most of the products we use are born and where they go off to die.
Sure. Well, the waste trade has slowed down a lot since then, I'm really happy to report, largely because of this Basel Convention. They took the waste sometimes because they didn't know what it was. They were lied to about what it was. Sometimes because nobody asked them, they just took it there. Sometimes because they were using it for raw materials for something else. Like most of the plastic in the United States collected in recycling programs is shipped overseas, where some of it is just dumped and some is reprocessed or downcycled into some secondary product. They took the waste because somebody was making money on it. You know, there were lots of cases I looked at where the government didn't even know. There was one case, for example, that I worked on where a US company had some hazardous waste. They wanted to get rid of it. They mixed it in with a load of fertilizer and sold the fertilizer to Bangladesh. And then Bangladeshi farmers put it all over their farm, and nobody knew until we found out through a very circumvent way and then exploded it to the media. But there's lots of cases like that. With e-waste, what's happening is that there's private business interests in other countries that are importing this stuff because they're making a business out of it. It doesn't mean that the community's endorsed it. It doesn't mean that it's good for the health of the country there, but it's just private business transactions.
The government mandated conversion from analog to digital television resulted in lots of televisions making their way to dumps. Talk a little bit about the impact of that, and apparently some companies are doing better than others.
Right. Well, the reason that televisions and computers and cell phones and all these things are so dangerous is because of the heavy metals and other toxic chemicals in them. Those big old televisions have about 4 to 7 pounds of lead in each of them. And lead is a very potent neurotoxin. It is not something we want dispersed into the environment. And in fact, in some states in the United States, it's illegal to land dispose them in landfills because we don't want it leaching into our groundwater. And so what happens is there's also valuable metal in these electronics. So in cell phones, there's about 50 cents worth of gold in every cell phone. There's silver, there's other valuable metals, there's copper. So what happens with this e-waste, as we call it, electronic waste or e-waste for short, is often it's shipped to places where workers smash it open, often with no protective gear at all, break it open, fish through it, and pull out the valuable parts, which are very tiny percent of the whole facility, the whole thing, and then the rest is just dumped over there. So it's enormous health problems for the workers, enormous environmental impacts. So with this digital deadline, when there's a national switchover from digital to analog or analog to digital broadcasts, all of our TVs stopped working overnight. Tens of millions of TVs stopped working overnight. So this was sort of, people call it the largest ever government planned example of planned obsolescence. Just perfectly good televisions were rendered useless overnight. So a lot of people use that as an excuse to go out and buy a flat screen TV. What we were advocating is to go get those little converter boxes so that you can continue to use your current TV. What we did in my family is we just decided, let's not have a TV. And I have to tell you, that's really the best option, because then you're no longer bombarding yourselves with messages to go buy stuff, and you have all that extra time to play games and cook together and go for walks and do exercise and be together, which has been a great improvement in our family.
The Electronics Take Back Coalition rates manufacturers for how they deal with their waste. Apple and Sony apparently have been leaders in removing chlorine and bromine from their e-products. My guess is, and I don't want to go back to buying our way out of this problem, but it sounds like an important thing for consumers to know. Vizio, for example, which is the #2 television maker in the country, isn't doing so well according to this ranking.
Yeah, the ranking that I really like is the ETBC, the campaign that you just mentioned, is good, but Greenpeace also has an electronics report card that looks at a whole bunch of different factors of electronics productions, and every year they reevaluate because the companies keep changing positions. Some will do great on one thing and then terrible the next year. Overall, a number of electronic companies are moving in the right direction in terms of getting toxic chemicals out, and that is great. And consumer awareness and consumer campaigns have definitely helped, but what's really helped is the European legislation that says get it out over there. I mean, that's been really helpful, which is, I'd love to see the same kind of legislation here. So while companies are moving in the right direction in terms of getting toxics out, what they're not moving in the right direction for, which I would love to have us all pressure them more on, is how disposable these things still are. You know, still cell phones last about a year, computers last for a couple of years. Why is it that we have to throw this whole thing away when, you know, some part of the keyboard stops working or when one little part stops working? I would like to see those companies work on making their products longer lasting, more durable. We say make it safe and make it last. More repairable. I mean, can you imagine taking these things in for repair like we used in the old days?
That's the problem. So many of us would like to have the toaster fixed, but it costs more if you can even find someone who services a toaster than it costs to go to your neighborhood box store and buy a new one.
Absolutely. I explore this much more in the book version of The Story of Stuff, is that what were the factors that industry had to put in place to get us as a society to accept the disposability of all these products that formerly had lasted for decades or sometimes even generations. I mean, my mother had the same telephone and toaster and kitchen clock and refrigerator my whole life. You know, nobody I know does now. We have to regularly replace these. And one of the factors that had to be created was to make it cheaper and easier to replace something than to repair it. And so appliance repair shops practically disappeared in this country. The good news about the current economic recession is that repair shops are coming back. Shoe repair shops are on the rise. Appliance repair shops are on the rise for the first time in decades. So I'm very excited. There's great job creation potential, great materials conservation potential. If we can get back into the mode of stewardship and responsible care for the things that we have rather than just chucking them and replacing them.
So if you have one of those services in your neighborhood, use it.
Yes, use it. You know, often they are the same price or more expensive than getting a new thing, but I still go and get my old things repaired. And if you do that, you can get a higher quality product to begin with, so it lasts much longer. Over the long term, it's less expensive than just constantly replacing this stuff every year.
One of the things you say in The Story of Stuff that to me was the most astounding, and correct me if I don't get this right, but something like 90% of the stuff we purchase is no longer in use 6 months later.
That's almost right. That's 99% of total material flow through the system. So it doesn't count just the things we purchased, but 99% of all the stuff that we harvest, mine, chop, process that run through the whole system is waste within 6 months. So for example, if I have a laptop computer, it doesn't mean just that laptop, although a lot of them are waste very quickly, but it means the tons of waste made to create that stuff. So total material flow, not just the stuff that we buy. 99% of that is waste within 6 months. Ray Anderson, the CEO of Interface Carpet, the largest floor covering company in the world, who's a real visionary on sustainability issues, he said that American industry are basically garbage making machines. Like, we just waste an enormous amount in the industry where the stuff is produced at the production stage as well as at home. It's just crazy. We cannot run a planet with that level of waste. We've got to slow it down. Use less stuff and use less toxic stuff. stuff. We've just got to move in that direction.
I want to talk a little bit about the project, because it's now the Story of Stuff project, and you coordinate it. And as I said, there are a number of new videos online right now. You can watch the story of electronics. The story of bottled water is coming soon. What's the story behind bottled water? I think we all know not to buy bottled water, but what's the situation?
So I'm very excited about these new films. We decided to make those because we had so much interest in the Story of Stuff, and people wanted to know more, and people wanted examples. So in the film we talked about things like planned obsolescence or manufactured demand or externalized costs, and lots of people wrote in and said, I want to know more examples of that. So we're making additional films to go deeper into the conversation with the people that like the Story of Stuff. So the bottled water film is the story of manufactured demand. It's a story about how some businesses got together, decided to sell us something that we didn't need and originally didn't even want, and that costs 2,000 times, literally 2,000 times more than we can get the stuff exactly from the kitchen sink. But yet how they were able to create this enormous international market for this stuff that we really didn't need. So it's the bottled water is the story of manufactured demand.
And this takes us back to the power of advertising.
Absolutely. Advertisers really play a key role in this. And so one of the efforts that I'm very excited about are efforts in this country to sort of decommercialize our society. Our landscape has become so advertising saturated that it's just this constant hum of messages telling us to buy stuff. And so I'm working with some groups like the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood that's saying get advertisements out of the school textbooks, get advertisements out of the schools. We've got to sort of decommercialize our society. Again, to instead of over-identifying as the consumer part of ourselves, to reinvigorate that citizen part of ourselves.
You have another video on your website. It's the story of cap and trade. And you're opposed to cap and trade. In fact, you say the idea is Wall Street's next bubble. There's some who say, but it's working in Europe.
Who's saying that? It's not working at all in Europe. The story of cap and trade is a little different than the other films because it's much more technical, and it was really a targeted intervention into a political discussion, much different than a sort of general awareness raising film. So it's a much more technical. Some people have said they've had to watch it a couple times to get it because it really is very complicated. The reason that we made this film is that the United States government, as well as internationally, I mean both are now stalled, but both nationally and internationally, the political processes were moving towards what I believe is a false solution. This cap and trade system for dealing with carbon. And when I decided to make this film, I called up all my friends who worked on environmental groups on climate issues, and I told them, I'm thinking of making this film, what do you think about cap and trade? And across the board, every single person I talked to, including people who've worked on climate issues for years, told me cap and trade will not work. It does not meet the science. It's not enough to avert the climate disaster, but it's the best we can get. And I kept saying, what do you mean it's the best we can get? They said, it's the only thing we can get past business. I said, wait a minute, who's running this country, us or business? Everybody said it's the best we can get. I said, you're confusing political reality with physical reality. Why would we as environmentalists get behind a law that everyone's saying will not work? I mean, it simply will not work. I felt sad, and I felt like our sense of political vision, our sense of possibility has been beaten out of us by 8 years of having an administration who didn't want to talk about science. But we shouldn't limit ourselves like that anymore. We need to aim higher. This is really the biggest environmental crisis we have ever faced, and taking the best we can get is not going to help anyone.
Well, some say waiting for the perfect solution. You know, if we combine cap and trade with new technology, for example, it's a first step. It's a positive first step, and to fight against it would be to move backward.
Right, and that's a very interesting point. Often, I mean, always in politics there's compromises, absolutely, of course. And often a half step or an imperfect solution is a move towards a better solution, so you have to take it. Sometimes a half step is actually reinforcing the problematic paradigm that got us into this problem. So in those kinds of cases, a half measure actually is regressive. It takes us back, and furthermore, it shuts the conversation. Because then when you want to come back and say, okay, let's fix it, they're like, we already discussed that. That bill's done. We're on to something else. And so I really feel like in this case, the current leading legislation, the cap and trade legislation in Congress, will solidify a fundamentally flawed approach to the climate and put a cap on the discussions as well. And we need to discuss it more.
In fact, you say it's a distraction.
Absolutely. The other thing is it won't spur innovations in clean technologies nearly as much as other approaches because they have this offset. So really, it's an investment in business as usual. And business as usual is what got us into this mess. I am not willing to put my eggs in the business as usual basket when the situation is so dire when it comes to climate.
So if not cap and trade, one or two things that you think would get us where we need to go?
Well, one thing that we could start doing today, literally, is that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, now it's clarified that they have the mandate to start reducing carbon. The EPA could today make a list of some of the biggest carbon polluters and start telling them you have to reduce your carbon. What are we waiting for? So it's a shame that it's taken so long for EPA to start, but this leading cap and trade legislation actually takes that authority away from EPA. That's one of the many reasons I'm baffled why any environmental group would support a law that takes authority to regulate carbon pollution away from the EPA. It's crazy, and that was one of the compromises that environmentalists made. You can only compromise so much before a solution's not a solution. So EPA could start right now in reducing the carbon.
The story of Stuff hit the internet in December of 2007. A lot has changed since 2007. Would you do anything differently with that video if you were to produce it today?
It's so funny. A lot of people ask me that. I would have had somebody help me afterwards because I was really not expecting the response. And so I was really floored for a while. I would have built up some extra resources and staff and stuff to help me. Because after the film came out, we literally got about 6,000 or 8,000 emails a day, many from people who said, I'm so inspired, what can I do to help? And it just pained me. I couldn't get back to them all. I just felt so sad if somebody was inspired for action and didn't get a response. So that still weighs on me heavily that I wasn't able to answer all those. I might have changed one sentence. When I talk about it's the government's role to take care of us, I might have just said, I don't mean tuck us in bed at night. Like, I think a very shallow interpretation of take care of us may have added to some of the controversy. I should have been a little more clear that I mean for them to help, send a fire truck when our house is on fire and ban neurotoxins in our cosmetics and, take that kind of action to take care of us, not, brush our teeth for us. So I think some people had a sort of knee-jerk response to the take care of us part, feeling like that was infantiling of us, and I certainly didn't mean that.
You're also coming out with a video about solutions, which you are tentatively titling The Story of Change. How optimistic are you really that we can turn the Titanic around here?
I am so optimistic, absolutely. Partly because of what I said before about change is inevitable. I mean, we are going to change by design or by default, but for our grandchildren, they're not going to be living and consuming the way we do now. The change is inevitable, so that's one thing I know we have to change. But the real reason I'm optimistic is because everywhere I go, I see people who care. Whether it's scientists that are developing new products from down to the molecular level, so they're inherently not toxic. That's exciting. New architects who are coming up with all kinds of green buildings to make buildings so that they can be climate neutral without all this energy for heating and cooling. I mean, it's amazing stuff that's happening, whether it's people rebuilding communities and reinvigorating cultural and other kinds of activities rather than commercial activities for personal enjoyment. It's across the spectrum, socially, politically, environmentally, ecologically, in every way. There are people all over this planet doing amazing work to turn things around. And with so many people caring, there's no way we can't do it.
Annie Leonard, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Annie Leonard. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu. You'll also find the full video for The Story of Stuff, as well as Leonard's latest videos. I'm Patty Satalia. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you for our next conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.